I'm Chris Rigney. I'm going to be doing a quick painting and explaining some of the processes and techniques that I use as I paint this apple. The first thing you've got to think about when you sit down to capture something, whether it's in paint or clay or music, you've got to think about what it is you actually want to say about something. What's the story you want to tell about it? You've got a unique perspective, and I think that's really what art is at the end of the day, is your view and how it differs from everyone else's view in the world. As I go about preparing to do a new painting, I think to myself, what is it that I'm actually trying to say about this object? What am I feeling? What are my emotions today? And how do they play into it? So it's really about learning how to see and how to feel more strongly so that you can really put yourself into the work. The first thing I often do is to put a bunch of inspiration images down in front of me. I like to have a handful of different types of images, often that contradict each other in style or color or any other factor that might make something new if you were to combine them together. Once I've decided how it is that I'm feeling and what it is about it that I'm trying to capture, I'll think of a way that I can represent this object in the most simple way, using just 3 or 4 or 5 shapes to kind of get the bones of it down that most strongly represents the way I'm thinking about it. There was an interesting documentary that I watched a year or two ago, and it was someone visiting Comic-Con in America, and they were interviewing a lot of the graphic artists and asking them what was the most important tip that they could pass on to people. Almost all of them seemed to recommend that learning gestures and gestural drawing was the most important skill that you could learn when learning to draw. Learning how to represent things through simple gestures can really get to the essence of something and capture the spirit of it. Egon Schiele has a quote: "His goal as an artist was to draw the perfect line." And I think this is a similar idea. How does it make you feel? What emotions come up? So for example, I'm looking at this apple, and even though it's bright and colorful, I'm sort of seeing some dark shadows on the underside of it. It's got a bit of a lean to it, and it's making me feel a little bit uncomfortable in the way it's tipping over to the right. I'm going to try and represent that idea in the most simple way as I begin to put it down. So the first thing I'll do is to try and capture the essence of this apple leaning to one side. So what I'll do is I'm seeing one big form over to the left-hand side, the big mass of the apple. And I can see that it's tilting off to the right-hand side. Another form I'm seeing is where the shadow is on the other side of the apple. So I'm going to put that in as a second form. And maybe the third one is where the stem is in the top, and that there's a little hole in there, and that really also has a big tipping sort of shape to it. So I think I'm sort of seeing 3 main forms there. You can refine them. So now I've got the basic forms of the apple, and they have a bit of energy to them. So now how do I begin to make these more real? Light. Light is how we build up the 3-dimensionality of things. But to understand light, we have to understand tone. The tone is the difference between the lightness and the darkness of colors. So I've just put a few colors out on the palette. Have a look at these same colors once I switch the screen to black and white. What you should notice is the black and white are very obviously a dark tone and a light tone. But the other colors, even though the colors differentiate them, once they're turned to black and white, the tones all are somewhat similar. So what we want to think about when we're starting to work with light is think less about the colors and more about how much black or how much white is in something. One of the artists that I first saw doing this really cleverly was Kirchner. Have a look at this painting and how he's totally ignored the actual way you should use color, and he's just used green to represent shade and yellow to represent light and red as an additional color to represent even darker shadow. and how you still can understand exactly what is happening with the light and shade, I'm going to use my knowledge of tone and color to put down some basic light and shade on the form. So for this one, I might use red to capture the shadows, and I might use a greeny yellow to capture the lighter areas. So this form, I can see that there's a lot of shade over this side, and then a bit sort of a greeny yellow with a little bit of white in it to capture the light over on this side. I might just work within that form. And then up the back, I might do a sort of a reddy green for the area where the stem is. I might add a tiny bit of black into that just to give it some depth. So I've got some basic colors here. Now I might build up a little bit of light and a little bit of shade within these forms. I want to keep the basic idea of these strong forms, but add a little bit more light and shade to make each one of these areas have their own depth to it. So on this green one, I might add in a little bit of red down in the bottom corner just to help build the idea of depth. And then on this red one, I might add a little bit of light up here, just as though the light is just coming from the top and just capturing the top edge there. Inside the core, I might just add a little bit in there as well. Now I want the apple to jump out a little bit from its background, so I might give the background a slightly different color. I'm seeing a little bit of blue in the tablecloth underneath the apple. I'm trying to accentuate anything small that I see that I can bring through in some way. So I'm just going to play up on some of the blues that I see. I don't mind using the same paintbrush for different colors, so I'm just going to wipe some of that red off and get some of the white onto my brush, into a little bit of that blue, and then just brush that on. And I might even make it a little bit more blue to make it a bit stronger. That other one was a little bit soft looking. I'm seeing some shadow underneath the apple, so I might then jump in with a little bit of black in the blue and add a little shadow in around the base of the apple. So now that the general base of the painting is there, I now want to begin to refine it and make it look finished. This is one of the best techniques I've ever learned in terms of making something go from looking like a sketch to a finished piece. And this all has to do with contrast. So contrast is the difference between the darkest and lightest areas. In music, it could be the difference between the loudest note and the softest note. I heard someone recently talking about, in a particular movie, they wanted to represent the idea of silence, but instead of eliminating all of the noise, they had a fly just buzzing. And because you could hear this fly so clearly, it really accentuated how quiet the whole scene felt in this big town, and just the small buzz of a fly was audible. And I think this really captures the idea of contrast. The loudest thing is only loud because it's relative to the quietest thing, and in a painting the brightest thing is only bright because it's in contrast to something dark. So what we want to do is now look at the painting and see where there are areas that are light and how we can make them sit against something which is dark in order to start making everything pop. So you're trying to find ways through color and tone to try and enhance the contrast between different elements. Because of this, when I'm painting, I tend to start with tones that are in the mid-range, and then I have somewhere to go with my darker tones and lighter tones towards the end. I think a lot of artists will tell you that you should start with the mid-tones and then do shadows over the top and then do light at the end. You can see in this image from Picasso the way he's done that. He's done all of these mid-tones and then he's come in and done big blocks of shadow and then done the highlights at the end in order to make certain aspects pop. To approach the idea of contrast in this image, what I would say to myself is, what is the brightest area that I want to accentuate? And that area, for example, in this one is probably the green. So this area of green up here, I really want that to jump out against something in the background behind it. So what I'm going to do is darken the background just behind where that light green is. So I'm going to grab a bit of blue, but I'm going to grab a darker blue this time, and just behind where the green is, I'm going to put some dark blue. There might be an object back there that you might want to represent in the blue. Then I might look at this area down the bottom left and think that I want that to be more of a shaded area. So might enhance some of the shading down there, and then in contrast to what we did in the top left, in this section of the background, I'm actually going to lighten it up so that the shadow stands out. On the apple in front of it. Now this area in the bottom right is interesting because there's a shadow here. So I don't want to make that lighter because I want to leave the shadow. So what I might do here is actually just jump in to where that shadow is, and just for a little section of it, paint a little bit of light color there, so that when I then come back in over the top with the red shadow on the apple, it will help it jump out. But you can still read this shadow down here. So now in the top section here, I might make that highlight pop out a bit. I might get a bit of white in there as well. Make that jump out. And then, similar to what I did over in the top left, I'm just going to grab a bit of dark color, a dark blue, and drop the dark blue, maybe even with a bit more black here. Drop that behind there to make the highlight jump out. Might add a bit more white. And I'm just going to add a little bit of that white to the other side of this, just to help it really jump out. I'm just going to come along with my black again, because I'm going through a phase of doing thick black lines around things, just because I help it finds me commit to shapes, commit to ideas rather than making them hazy. So I'm just going to come in with my black. Because I'm using such cheap paints here, they're kind of really transparent, so I tend to have to go over them lots of times. But if you're using better quality paints, that shouldn't happen. So I'm just going to go back over this. Probably got a bit too much black in that one. Just going to go back over this. I'm finding this area in the bottom right a bit dark, so I'm going to bring a bit of green into that, just to lighten it up. You might see the way this black and this red are in color makes it difficult to see. So I'm just going to run a little bit of green in so that that line stands out, and I might do the same along here too. Now you might think with all this play of color that I should be talking more about color, but I actually really don't think color is that important. I've pretty much run out of yellow paint, and it kind of just makes it more interesting. Picasso had a quote that if you don't have blue, you should just use red. And I think that's really true. Just work with what you have. If you don't have red to paint a red apple, just use a different color. I don't think it's really that important. I think getting tone right can often be more important, but even so, just work with what you have. It's really more about trying to put your energy and your emotion and feeling into it, learning how to think and see, and your connection with the thing it is that you're trying to paint. So don't stress too much about color. Work quickly, use whatever materials you have. If you don't have the right colors, don't think too much about it. Just keep moving, and you might even end up with something more interesting at the end of it. Now I'm just going to do the finishing touches, some white and some black. It often helps if you squint your eyes and look at what you're doing. You'll really see the way things all blur together and everything just becomes a bunch of light or dark colors. So when I squint my eyes, I can really see that I want some more white up in this top corner, some more white at the top of this form, and I also want some white in the background down here to help that shadow pop on the bottom left. I'm just going to run that white right off the edge just because I feel like it. I want to make this line stand out too, so I might even run the white sort of up along there. I might even just run it in. I can do the same up here so that that black line becomes visible. Same thing in the middle. I can't see this black line through here because everything on both sides of it is dark red. So I'm just going to run a bit of white up through the middle. So I just want to be able to see all these forms really clearly. So I really like that I'm beginning to bring this form out. Enhance that shadow down the bottom. And now that I've enhanced the shadow, I might enhance the white next to it to make that shadow pop. I'm losing the blue in the background, but that's all right. See what happened when I did that, how much more that shadow jumps out. Get that stem in there, a little bit of red shadow inside that hole. And might bring a few more highlights just down this side of the apple here, as well as a bit of texture. That's a 10-minute explanation of how I approach many of my paintings. I think about what I'm actually trying to convey. I find some inspiration. I try and capture it in a few main forms, and I try to create those forms using strong gestural movements to give them energy. I use light and tone and shade and color to get the basic depth and three-dimensionality. And then at the end, I use contrast in dark shadows and highlights to bring it all together and make things pop. So I hope this is helpful. It's not the prettiest painting. This is just a quick one so that you can hopefully understand some of the basic principles and ideas that I use and maybe try and play with them yourself. Hopefully this was helpful.